Brad, I enjoyed hearing very much what you had to say, and I agree with you. I think on a lot of questions we're kind of on the same page, and I don't feel much could be gained by just sort of patting each other on the back and agreeing with each
Yeah.
other. I wondered though whether one thing that did come up when you were speaking is your love of Dogen.
Hmm.
Now I've always found Dogen infuriating.
Me too. So
Okay, good. Um, and I've recently I'm writing the book I'm writing at the moment. I'm writing a chapter on Buddha nature, which is something outside of what I usually get
mm,
into. But one of my my starting point on Buddha nature is Dogen,
right.
because I find that his essay called Busho,
Yeah.
Buddha nature, in the Shobogenzo, I think is marvelous. And of course, it helps that he actually affirms that Buddha nature is what is this thing and how did it get here? It's the Koan of Huineng and Huairan, which I practiced in Korea. So that has always inspired me. It's a very
Hmm.
important text for me. But when I try to read the whole essay, I find there are little glimpses of brilliance, a sentence here, a sentence there, and a lot of what sounds to me like not fully worked out waffle. And I'd like to know
It's
your
possible.
how do you get into Dogen?
Oh.
What your experience? You work presumably with the Japanese. You're working with teachers who are steeped in this tradition. Share with me what really speaks to you in the work of Dogen.
Oh gosh, that's yeah, that's difficult. I have to confess, it's been a long time since I read Bouchot, so I don't. I've read it, but I can't quote it or anything. Just in Dogen in general, it was good to study with Nishijima Roshi because he was really he was a self-made Dogen scholar. He a lot of Dogen scholars dismiss him, which annoys me because I think he really did know his stuff when it came to Dogen, but he didn't come up through a university or anything like that learning about Dogen. He just studied it on his own. And he had a good way of presenting it, and he had this little formula which was he made up the mnemonic, or somebody made up the mnemonic, SOAR, SOAR. So subjective, objective, action, and reality, as saying that Dogen often looks at things in through 4 points of view: a subjective point of view, an objective point of view, a point of view that is based on action, and reality itself, which is where it gets all strange and poetic. And and I thought, well, that it doesn't always break down quite as easily as that, but in certain parts of his writing, it's hard to refute what Nishijima had discovered there, because it does seem like he does it like that. So that helped. But often I think, like you, when I'm looking at Dogen, there are points where I'm just like, I have no idea. And what was interesting when I did those books, Don't Be a Jerk, and what's it called? It Came from Beyond Zen, where I tried to rewrite Dogen in my own words. I was looking at every translation I could find into English of whatever work, whatever piece I was working on, and also looking at the Japanese. When none of the English translations agreed with each other, I would look at the Japanese and see what it was. And there were few times where I'm looking at a bunch of English translations that seem to all be saying something different. And then I look at the Japanese and I'm going to go, now I know why they all say something different, because I have no idea what this says, and probably everybody who's looking at it goes, I don't know what this sentence means, and then they just kind of, they have to put something in there. So they put something in there, and that's what you get. And they all put something different. There are lots of places like that. Dogen is a funny character because I I like him because that's the tradition I came out of, and the more I think about it, the more I think, that's weird, because Nishijima Roshi really loved Dogen, and Tim was, came from Koban Chino. Tim didn't talk about Dogen as much, but he Koban did talk about Dogen a lot, so we got that. So it was always Dogen, Dogen, Dogen. So I kind of made a point in my early studies of like, okay, this is the stream I'm into, and I'm just going to focus on that, and try to figure that out. And then, and not really, I wasn't really studying the wider Buddhist tradition. And it's only been in more recent years that I've started looking at other things in the tradition. and it's interesting to see how they relate. You know, I'll look at some sutra that Dogen references and go, that's what it says in this sutra. You know, it seems different. I don't know, somehow. I don't know if I would have interpreted it that way, the way he did. Um, and I don't know, I just enjoy it because I just kind of got really deeply steeped into it. He is infuriating though. He contradicts himself all the time, and sometimes he just kind of goes off, like you say, and you know, I don't know if he's saying anything, you know. He has a kind of economy of words, I think. So I don't think he's just putting words in there to fill up space, but I have no idea what it is sometimes. So I have the same frustration. Yeah. But
I like Dogen too, because he somehow gives us permission, I think, to allow our poetic side to find voice. And I like, I think when I read Dogen, I get the sense he's sort of thinking out loud to himself in a way. And I enjoy that. I notice in the chat here, somebody says, funny that Stephen finds Dogen infuriating, yet loves Nagarjuna. That's a good point, actually.
yeah.
Because I suddenly realized, well, yes, actually, Nagarjuna is not crystal clear either, and in fact, that's part of the attraction. I'm attracted to Nagarjuna in some ways because of the rhythms of the language as much as actually the content of what he says. I just like the wordplay, the games that he engages with. There's a playfulness there. And I feel in many ways that the power of the text, like the power of poetry, comes through not because of some proposition or truth claim that is being made, but because almost through the sing-song effect of the language itself. And I think that that's somehow communicating, values, meanings, feelings, emotions that cannot be held by, the more sort of formal Buddhist sutras and philosophical treatises and so on. And Nagarjuna, I think, is deliberately seeking to somehow overturn that habit of mind to always want to have clear-cut propositions. This is true, this is false, this is right, this is wrong. And I wonder whether you feel that Dogen is also playing that sort of game with us as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's sometimes when that aspect that Nishijima Roshi identified as reality in the SOAR, when he's talking about that, that's usually the parts where Dogen just kind of says something that you're like, what? I don't know. It gets very poetic and funny and very open. And so yeah, I think he's doing that. And I was going to ask you, but along those lines, when you read Nagarjuna, are you reading it in English or Chinese or Sanskrit, or because it's different, when you read these things in
the other languages. I mean, I published a book called Verses from the Center.
I read that one. I like that one.
Which is a rendition of Nagarjuna, and I don't know Sanskrit. I mean, I think that's clearly to write a book on Nagarjuna, you should know Sanskrit in an academic setting. You wouldn't get away with it. But my language in which I trained was Tibetan, and I can read classical Tibetan really quite easily, quite well. It's a language I'm quite fluent in, and so I can read Nagarjuna in Tibetan. It was translated probably 1,000 years ago from Sanskrit. And the Tibetan text has got a great beauty to it too. It's in metered verse. It's lovely. I really enjoy reading. It's not difficult to read. It's not always easy to say what it means necessarily. But what I did was I first did a translation which was very literal, sticking as close as I could to the actual Tibetan sentences, the syntax, the grammar, trying to get all of that right. I followed Tsongkhapa's 14th century commentary and tried to get it as precisely as possible without any interest in it being good English or readable. And then I took that literal translation as the first draft of a poem. And then I quite deliberately, I would walk around my office reading this stuff aloud, and editing it where I felt the language, where a line or a verse or several verses was superfluous. I had the strong feeling that the text was actually contained a number of voices, a core voice of Nagarjuna, but probably other material that had been built in subsequently. And I tried to boil it down to a language that both kept the poetic power of the text and also did not betray what the grammar and the syntax and the structures of the sentences were saying. And I found that an incredibly valuable experience. It took me about 5 years.
Yeah.
I did this while I was in England. It was a very, very rich experience. But in the end, I basically produced a version which is really my own, my own reading, admittedly a free translation in places, but more poetic. And I hope that that communicates something of what Nagarjuna is trying to do.
It's really difficult to do that because there's no way you can reach back into somebody's mind and say, this is what, translators or commentators are always fond of saying, well, what Dogen means here is, and I've done it too, but I don't know what Dogen, I mean, I can't ask him what he means. He didn't speak English. He's coming from a completely different cultural setting, and just the technology that's available to us these days and things has changed the world so much that but so it's impossible to say, but it's really interesting to try to get into it and to try to see if you can say the same thing in your own way. So that's interesting.
Well, maybe the question is not to say the same thing in your own way, but to say what is, in a sense, true and meaningful and central to your life in your way. And I feel both Nagarjuna, little Dogen, and others are in a way, I think, giving us examples of finding your own voice.
No, yeah.
And this, I think, is more and more I feel that this is crucial. I think in the articulation or the expression of the Dharma is to find your own voice, to become more autonomous in your practice, and to allow your own intuitions and your own yearnings and your own values to somehow find a language of their own. And I must admit, I mean, when I first read which was your first book?
Hardcore Zen.
Hardcore Zen. What I really liked about it was that your voice came through. A lot of Dharma books about, it's a bit plodding, maybe very sincere and very reverential to tradition and quoting the right sources and so on. And what I liked about your book was that it actually gave voice not only to you as an individual, but to your upbringing and culture, your punk whole background, which is to me completely alien. And but there was a freshness in that really struck me. I didn't necessarily agree with everything you said. That's not the point. But what I really admired was your courage, first of all, to say it in this way. And I could see that this is how the Dharma, in a way, will find its course in modernity, is through the activating of voices that have the willingness and the honesty and hopefully the depth of experience to match. That can somehow help all of us to find a discourse that will break us free from some of these classical figures from Asia and elsewhere, and really, in a way, create a new language.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to happen. Although it's important to try not to distort it or add something that doesn't belong there, and that's always a kind of a struggle for me, is to try to say that what's actually important to say. But I had a question for you.
Yes,
which I don't know, because you touched on it briefly doing it's something that's interested me for a long time. So this is the koan practice, because as you know, probably the Soto style doesn't do that. In the Dogen's sort of version, he was fairly critical of that sort of practice where you work on the koans. And I don't know if I can formulate my question exactly. I just sort of was like, what is that like? It's sort of is sort of my question, because I've never done it. And Nishijima Roshi was kind of, he didn't like it. He was pretty critical of it too, but he's probably more critical of the sort of formalized way it's done in Japan, rather than of the practice itself. But yeah, did you do that?
Well, yeah, I think it's important to distinguish the fact that Koan practice in Korea is very different from Koan practice in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Japanese Rinzai Koan practice, as I understand it, I've not
Hmm.
trained in it myself, was largely reformed by Hakuin in the 18th century and developed into what is often called now Koan study, where you go through the different koans and you work with one, and then you, whatever you do, and then you come up with some acceptable response to that, and then the teacher will then pass you on to the next one. In Korea, and I don't think they did that in China either.
Hmm.
You just basically have one koan,
Mm.
and that koan is, it may have a form of words like "what is this," but there's actually only one koan, and that's you, your
Mm.
life, existence, reality, whatever you call it. That your life presents itself to you as a question,
Mhm.
and you learn to stay with that question. If you look at the text on the wall there, that was written by my Zen teacher, Kuzan Sunim, in the early 80s. And it says, "What is this? Great questioning means great awakening." That's what the text says. And I stayed with the question, "What is this?" Throughout my whole training. That's all I ever asked myself was, "What is this?" And the way in which it works is that the first thing you have to do is burn off the habit of coming up with an answer. Of course, when you start doing it, your mind keeps generating suitably enigmatic Zen type answers,
Mhm.
or you find the mind is actively saying, "What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean?" But at a certain point, you kind of give up on that. You drop it. The mind sort of just gets burnt out doing that. And then you come to rest in what is called the sensation of doubt, the
Oh,
great.
yeah.
And the great doubt is really the feeling of questioning. It's very close to what Socrates talked about wonder. He says the origin of philosophy is wonder, and the feeling of wonder is what makes a person's life philosophical. You find that in the Theaetetus dialogue of Plato. And this is very close to that. It's about it. Well, the difference is it is held within a contemplative discipline.
Yeah.
In other words, when you sit in meditation, or even when you're doing walking, or you just try to make more and more, you make yourself more and more aware of what it feels like to wonder, what it feels like to question. And sometimes we would actually, be told to concentrate that feeling in the belly, in
Mhm.
the dandian in Chinese, so that you actually are getting out of your head into your gut.
Yeah.
And that becomes the kind of center of gravity for this questioning. And the idea that you will one day come up with an answer and the Zen master will say, "Well done, Stephen, you got
Yeah.
it right."
Yeah.
That whole narrative is gone,
Yeah.
completely gone. The point is to start to learn to really deeply value in a visceral sense the extraordinary question of what it means to be alive, and to stay with the question and without the feeling that you need to have some kind of answer.
That's interesting. It's real interesting. It sounds a little bit. I've been reading a lot of the Advaita Vedanta tradition lately, and Ramana Maharshi, you're probably familiar with, has that "Who am I?" is his question. They're kind of into that idea of having a question. And Dogen has the Genjo Koan, which I'm sure you're
Yeah, absolutely.
familiar with, which is sort of the great koan.
Or the koan of everyday life.
Yeah.
The Advaita of the Ramana Maharshi, what is, who am I,
Yeah.
basically. Um, if you read Ramana's work, I mean, he gives you we already have the answer.
Mm.
The answer is that, you are not your body, you're not your mind,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
not your thoughts, that you are this great Atman, or this, God, basically. And so, in other words, I find it somehow, it's a bit of a setup.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see
Kind of
that.
already have an idea of what it is you're meant to get. And to be quite honest, my teacher in Korea too, had a rather clear idea as to what you were supposed to get out of this,
Mm.
to really, understand the true nature of shin, of mind, of
Oh,
spirit,
okay. Yeah.
art, or whatever you translate that. And I never felt comfortable with that. it seemed as though there was, an assumption of what this enlightenment experience would be like, and how you could maybe confirm it as having happened. That never interested me.
Mm-hmm.
I think in many ways I was inspired in this questioning both by Madhyamaka philosophy, Nagarjuna, just penetratingly asking what on earth is the nature of this life, this stuff. But also I was very inspired by Heidegger, by phenomenology, German existentialist philosophy. And Heidegger has a book called Introduction to Metaphysics, which starts with the question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing?
Mm-hmm.
And that question, which actually goes back to Leibniz, I think, and I think it's a echo of Plato even. To me, that's the question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
That question, when I read that for the first time, it's like a tingle went down my spine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that to me is the great doubt, the great question, the great perplexity, however we translate this word, eishim in Korean.
Mm-hmm.